Welcome back, thanks for tuning to our Reddit cheating stories. Which country are you watching from? Drop in a comment. Let's dive in. Mark Thompson was living the dream, or so it seemed. He had a beautiful home nestled in the quiet, upscale suburb of Willow Creek. A thriving career as a software engineer at a cutting-edge tech company, where he was known for his problem-solving skills. And, most importantly, a wife who took his breath away every single day. Sarah Thompson was everything Mark had ever wanted. She was radiant, intelligent, and possessed a captivating charm that could light up any room. They had met at a mutual friend's wedding 5 years ago, and it had been love at first sight, at least for Mark. Within a year, they were married, promising each other forever under the warm summer sun. Their life together started like a fairy tale. They traveled, renovated their home, and built a comfortable life filled with laughter and shared dreams. Mark was utterly devoted to Sarah, showering her with affection and support. He worked hard, often putting in extra hours, to ensure she had everything her heart desired. He trusted her implicitly. He couldn't imagine a world without her. However, beneath the shimmering surface of their idyllic existence, cracks were beginning to appear. Subtle shifts in Sarah's behavior went unnoticed by Mark, blinded as he was by his adoration. She started spending more time out with her friends, often returning late, full of excuses that sounded plausible enough. He dismissed his occasional pangs of unease as the product of his own insecurities. Sarah also became increasingly critical of Mark, pointing out his flaws, both real and imagined. She complained about his long hours, his lack of attention, and his perceived lack of ambition. Mark, desperate to please her, tried harder, but his efforts only seemed to fuel her discontent. The more he gave, the less she seemed to appreciate it. One particular evening, Mark arrived home early from work, eager to surprise Sarah with a romantic dinner. He'd even managed to snag a reservation at her favorite Italian restaurant. He walked into the house, calling out her name, but there was no response. A strange silence hung in the air, a silence that felt heavier than usual. He found Sarah in the living room, curled up on the sofa, seemingly asleep. As he approached, he noticed a discarded glass of wine on the coffee table and a faint scent of perfume that wasn't hers. He gently nudged her awake. "Sarah. I'm home. I got us a reservation at Dash." Sarah startled awake, her eyes wide and unfocused. She blinked a few times, as if trying to orient herself. "Mark. What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice slightly slurred. "I finished work early. I wanted to surprise you," he said, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she replied, a little too quickly. "Just tired. I had a long day." Mark tried to shake off the feeling that something was amiss. He chalked it up to stress and fatigue. He was so deeply in love, so invested in the illusion of perfection, that he refused to see the glaring red flags. The tension between Mark and Sarah continued to escalate in the weeks that followed. They argued more frequently, and the joy that had once filled their home seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a chilling frost. Mark felt increasingly isolated, as if he were living with a stranger. One Saturday morning, while Sarah was out with her friends, again, Mark decided to tackle a long overdue task, cleaning out the garage. He hated the garage, it was dark and dusty and filled with all the things they no longer needed. While rummaging through a box of old photographs, he stumbled upon a small, velvet jewelry box. He didn't recognize it. Sarah had plenty of jewelry, but he'd never seen this particular box before. Curiosity piqued, he opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a diamond necklace. It was exquisitely beautiful, far more expensive than anything he had ever purchased for Sarah. A cold dread washed over him. He knew, with a certainty that pierced him to the core, that the necklace was not from him. He examined it closely, searching for a clue, a hint of who might have given it to her. Then, he noticed a small inscription engraved on the clasp. It was barely visible, but he made out the initials J.C. His mind raced. Who was J.C.? He didn't know anyone with those initials who was close to Sarah. He tried to dismiss the suspicion that gnawed at him, but the evidence was too damning to ignore. Later that evening, when Sarah returned home, Mark confronted her. He held out the jewelry box, his hand trembling slightly. "What is this, Sarah?" he asked, his voice strained. Sarah paled. She stared at the box as if it were a venomous snake. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. Don't lie to me, Mark said, his voice rising. This necklace. Who gave it to you? Sarah tried to snatch the box from his hand, but Mark pulled it away. It's just something I bought for myself, she said, her eyes darting around the room. Don't insult my intelligence, Mark retorted, his anger surging. It's engraved with the initials JC. Who is JC? Sarah remained silent, her face a mask of defiance. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she sighed and said, It's a friend from work. A friend? Mark scoffed. A friend who buys you expensive diamond necklaces. Is that what you call a friend? It's not what you think, Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking. It's complicated. Complicated? Mark repeated, incredulous. How complicated can it be? You're married, Sarah. Or have you forgotten that? The argument escalated, their voices echoing through the house. Mark demanded to know the truth, and Sarah continued to evade, offering half-truths and flimsy excuses. Finally, driven to the edge, Mark grabbed Sarah's phone. He wanted to see who she was texting, who she was calling. Sarah screamed and lunged at him, trying to wrestle the phone away. In the ensuing struggle, the phone slipped from Mark's grasp and clattered to the floor. The screen cracked. See what you made me do? Sarah shrieked. You're always so controlling. I can't stand it anymore. Mark stared at her, his heart breaking. He had never seen her so angry, so full of resentment. He realized, with a sickening certainty, that he didn't know this woman. The woman he had loved, the woman he had built his life around, was a stranger. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling. He knew he shouldn't, but he couldn't resist the urge to see the truth, no matter how painful. He managed to unlock it, navigating to her text messages. There it was. A string of messages between Sarah and a contact saved as JC. The messages were explicit, intimate, and filled with promises of love and shared futures. Mark felt as if he had been punched in the gut. The world around him seemed to spin. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes filled with pain and betrayal. How could you do this to me? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah didn't respond. She simply stared back at him, her expression cold and indifferent. The next few days were a blur of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak. Mark confronted Sarah with the evidence of her affair, and she finally admitted the truth. She had been seeing a colleague named James Carter for several months. She claimed that she had fallen in love with him and that she was no longer happy in her marriage with Mark. Mark was devastated. He had poured his heart and soul into their relationship, and she had betrayed him in the most profound way imaginable. He felt like his entire world was crumbling around him. He demanded that she leave. He couldn't bear to be in the same house with her any longer. Sarah readily agreed. She packed her bags and moved out, leaving Mark alone in the house that had once been filled with so much love and laughter. But Sarah's departure was not the end of Mark's nightmare. It was only the beginning. A week later, 2 police officers arrived at his door. They informed him that he was being arrested for assault. Assault? Mark asked, bewildered. What are you talking about? The officers explained that Sarah had filed a police report, claiming that Mark had physically assaulted her during their argument about the necklace. She alleged that he had punched her, choked her, and threatened her life. Mark was stunned. He had never laid a hand on Sarah in his life. He had been angry, yes, but he had never resorted to violence. He tried to explain this to the officers, but they were unmoved. They handcuffed him and took him into custody. He was taken to the local police station, booked, and thrown into a holding cell. He felt numb, disoriented, and utterly betrayed. How could Sarah do this to him? How could she twist the truth so completely? He spent a sleepless night in the cell, replaying the events of the past few weeks in his mind. He realized that Sarah had been planning this for a long time. She had been systematically building a case against him, creating a false narrative of abuse and control. She had set him up. The next morning, he was arraigned in court. He pleaded not guilty to the charges, but the judge set a high bail. Mark couldn't afford to pay it. He was remanded into custody, awaiting trial. He sat in his jail cell, consumed by despair. He was innocent, yet he was being treated like a criminal. His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted, had framed him. He had no idea how he was going to prove his innocence. He felt utterly alone and helpless. Life in jail was a brutal awakening. Mark, a man accustomed to comfort and privacy, was thrust into a world of violence, intimidation, and constant fear. The other inmates were a mix of hardened criminals and desperate souls, all struggling to survive in a system that seemed designed to crush them. He was immediately marked as an outsider, a soft target. His quiet demeanor and lack of street smarts made him vulnerable to exploitation. He quickly learned that survival depended on finding allies and avoiding conflict. He met a few inmates who were willing to offer him advice and protection, but their help came at a price. He had to be discreet, watchful, and above all, trustworthy. He learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the prison, to read the subtle cues and unspoken rules that governed life inside. The days were long and monotonous. He spent his time reading, exercising, and trying to keep his mind occupied. He wrote letters to his family and friends, pleading for their help, but few responded. They were either unwilling to believe his story or afraid to get involved. His lawyer, a overworked public defender, was sympathetic but overwhelmed. She assured him that she would do her best to defend him, but she cautioned him that the evidence against him was circumstantial but compelling. Sarah's testimony, combined with the lack of any witnesses to corroborate Mark's story, made his case an uphill battle. The isolation was the hardest part. He missed his home, his friends, his work. He missed the simple pleasures of life, a warm shower, a good meal, a quiet evening with a book. He longed for human connection, for a kind word, a friendly face. But in jail, kindness was a rare commodity. He started to lose hope. He began to doubt himself, to question his own sanity. Was he truly innocent? Had he somehow provoked Sarah, driven her to this extreme? He replayed their arguments in his mind, searching for clues, for explanations. But he found none. He slipped into a deep depression. He lost his appetite, his energy, his will to fight. He spent his days staring at the walls of his cell, consumed by despair. He felt like he was drowning, suffocating under the weight of Sarah's lies. One day, he received a letter from his mother. It was a simple, heartfelt message, filled with love and encouragement. She told him that she believed in him, that she knew he was a good man, and that she would do everything in her power to help him. Her words gave him a glimmer of hope. He realized that he couldn't give up. He had to fight for his freedom, for his reputation, for his life. He owed it to himself, to his family, and to the truth. He started to focus on his case, working with his lawyer to gather evidence and build a defense. He interviewed witnesses, contacted friends, and searched for any information that could help prove his innocence. It was a long and arduous process, but he was determined to see it through. As the trial date approached, Mark's lawyer, Emily Carter, no relation to James Carter, Sarah's lover, began to dig deeper into Sarah's background. She felt that something was amiss, that Sarah's story didn't quite add up. Emily was a young, tenacious attorney with a sharp mind and a compassionate heart. She had taken on Mark's case because she believed in his innocence. She saw the pain and desperation in his eyes, and she was determined to help him clear his name. She started by interviewing Sarah's friends, the women she had supposedly been spending time with in the weeks leading up to the arrest. To Emily's surprise, none of them could corroborate Sarah's stories. Some of them admitted that they had rarely seen Sarah during that period, while others claimed that she had been acting strangely, secretive and agitated. Emily also discovered that Sarah had a history of financial problems. She had racked up significant debts and had been struggling to make ends meet. Emily suspected that Sarah might have been motivated by money, that she had framed Mark in order to gain access to his assets. She then turned her attention to James Carter, Sarah's lover. She discovered that he was a man of questionable character, with a reputation for being a womanizer and a manipulator. He had a string of failed relationships and a history of financial impropriety. Emily interviewed James, but he denied any involvement in Sarah's scheme. He claimed that he had been unaware of her plans and that he was just as shocked as everyone else by Mark's arrest. However, Emily didn't believe him. She sensed that he was hiding something. She decided to hire a private investigator to look into James's background. The investigator uncovered a web of deceit and manipulation. He discovered that James had been pressuring Sarah to leave Mark and that he had promised her a life of luxury and excitement. He had also been secretly funneling money into her bank account, presumably as an incentive to go through with the plan. Emily now had a solid theory. She believed that Sarah and James had conspired together to frame Mark, with the goal of gaining access to his money and starting a new life together. She needed to prove it in court. She confronted Sarah with her findings, but Sarah remained defiant. She denied the allegations and insisted that Mark had been abusive and controlling. She accused Emily of trying to smear her reputation and of siding with a criminal. Emily knew that she had a tough fight ahead of her. She had to convince the jury that Sarah was a liar and that Mark was an innocent victim. She had to expose the conspiracy and reveal the truth. The trial began, and the courtroom was packed with spectators. The atmosphere was tense and charged with emotion. Mark sat at the defense table, his face pale but resolute. He knew that his future hung in the balance. The prosecution presented their case first, calling Sarah to the stand. She recounted her version of events, portraying Mark as a jealous and controlling husband who had flown into a rage when he discovered her affair. She described the alleged assault in graphic detail, emphasizing the physical and emotional trauma she had suffered. She painted a picture of Mark as a violent and unpredictable man, someone who was capable of anything. Her testimony was convincing, and the jury seemed sympathetic to her plight. Emily cross-examined Sarah, challenging her inconsistencies and pointing out the holes in her story. She questioned her about her financial problems, her relationship with James Carter, and her motives for framing Mark. Sarah became defensive and evasive, struggling to maintain her composure. Her credibility began to erode. Emily then called James Carter to the stand. He denied any involvement in the conspiracy, but his demeanor was nervous and shifty. Emily relentlessly questioned him about his relationship with Sarah, his financial dealings, and his motivations. James cracked under pressure. He admitted that he had been having an affair with Sarah and that he had been providing her with money. He claimed that he had done so out of love, but Emily argued that it was part of a larger plan to frame Mark. Emily presented evidence of James's financial impropriety, his history of failed relationships, and his manipulative behavior. She portrayed him as a con artist who had used Sarah as a pawn in his scheme. The prosecution objected, arguing that Emily was engaging in character assassination. But the judge overruled the objection, allowing Emily to continue her line of questioning. Emily then called Mark to the stand. He testified in his own defense, denying the allegations and recounting his version of events. He spoke with honesty and sincerity, conveying the pain and betrayal he had experienced. He explained that he had never laid a hand on Sarah and that he had been falsely accused. He described his love for her, his devotion to their marriage, and his shock and disbelief when he discovered her affair. His testimony was powerful and moving, and the jury seemed to be swayed by his sincerity. Emily then called several witnesses to corroborate Mark's story. His friends and family testified to his good character and his peaceful nature. They stated that he had never been violent or abusive. Emily also presented evidence that contradicted Sarah's claims. She showed that Sarah had been lying about her injuries and that the physical evidence did not support her allegations. The trial lasted for several days, and the jury deliberated for hours. Finally, they reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed back in. Mark sat at the defense table, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to expect. The foreperson of the jury stood and delivered the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Thompson, not guilty of all charges. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Mark's eyes welled up with tears of relief. He was free. Emily embraced him, congratulating him on his victory. His family and friends rushed forward, showering him with hugs and kisses. The prosecution looked defeated. Sarah sat in the gallery, her face a mask of anger and disbelief. The judge thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. He then turned to Mark and said, "Mr. Thompson, you are free to go." Mark walked out of the courtroom a free man. He had been through hell, but he had survived. He had been falsely accused, unjustly imprisoned, and nearly destroyed. But he had maintained his innocence and fought for his freedom. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. He had to rebuild his life, repair his reputation, and heal his emotional wounds. But he was determined to do so. He had learned valuable lessons during his ordeal, lessons about trust, betrayal, and the resilience of the human spirit. Life after jail was a struggle. Mark found himself ostracized by many in his community. The accusations, even though proven false, had tainted his reputation. Many former friends and acquaintances kept their distance, unwilling to associate with someone who had been accused of such serious crimes. Finding a job proved difficult. His previous employer, though sympathetic, couldn't risk the negative publicity of rehiring him. He faced countless rejections, the shadow of the trial looming over every interview. He started to feel the weight of the injustice, the lingering stain of Sarah's lies. Financially, he was in dire straits. Legal fees had drained his savings, and the period of incarceration had left him with nothing. He had to sell his house, the beautiful home he and Sarah had built together, just to stay afloat. He moved into a small, modest apartment, a far cry from the life he had once known. Despite these hardships, Mark refused to be defeated. He drew strength from the unwavering support of his mother and a few close friends who had stood by him throughout the ordeal. He resolved to rebuild his life, to prove to himself and to the world that he was more than just the accusations leveled against him. He started by volunteering at a local charity, helping other wrongly accused individuals navigate the legal system. He found purpose in assisting those who had suffered similar injustices, providing them with support and guidance. This work helped him process his own trauma and find a sense of meaning in his suffering. He also enrolled in a coding bootcamp, determined to update his skills and re-enter the tech industry. He excelled in the program, quickly mastering new technologies and demonstrating his innate talent. He poured his energy into learning, finding solace and satisfaction in the challenge. Slowly but surely, things began to improve. He secured a freelance coding project, followed by a full-time position at a smaller, more progressive tech startup. He impressed his new colleagues with his work ethic, his problem-solving abilities, and his positive attitude. He began to regain his confidence and rebuild his professional reputation. As Mark began to heal, he grappled with the complex emotions of anger, resentment, and bitterness towards Sarah. He couldn't understand how she could have betrayed him so completely, how she could have been so cruel and vindictive. He knew that holding on to these negative emotions was detrimental to his well-being. He wanted to move on, to find peace, but he couldn't seem to let go of the pain. He sought therapy, hoping to find a way to process his trauma and forgive Sarah. His therapist helped him understand the psychology of betrayal, the root causes of Sarah's behavior, and the importance of self-compassion. He came to realize that Sarah's actions were not a reflection of his worth as a person. They were a reflection of her own insecurities, her own unhappiness, and her own flawed character. He understood that holding on to anger and resentment would only perpetuate his suffering, while forgiveness, though difficult, could pave the way for healing and liberation. Forgiveness didn't mean condoning Sarah's actions. It didn't mean forgetting what she had done. It meant releasing the emotional grip she had on him, freeing himself from the burden of anger and resentment. It was a process, not an event, and it required patience, compassion, and a willingness to let go. Slowly, Mark began to find a measure of forgiveness. He still felt the pain of betrayal, but he no longer allowed it to consume him. He focused on the present, on building a new life, on creating a future filled with happiness and fulfillment. Years passed. Mark continued to thrive in his career. He became a senior developer at his company, earning a reputation for his expertise and leadership. He bought a new house, smaller than his previous one, but filled with warmth and character. He started dating again, cautiously at first, but eventually finding love with a kind and compassionate woman named Olivia. Olivia understood his past, respected his struggles, and embraced him for who he was, imperfections and all. Olivia was a teacher, passionate about education and committed to making a difference in the lives of her students. She was intelligent, witty, and had a contagious laugh that filled Mark's life with joy. They shared a deep connection based on mutual respect, trust, and genuine affection. One day, Mark received an unexpected letter. It was from Sarah. She wrote that she was deeply remorseful for what she had done. She admitted that she had been selfish and misguided, that she had made terrible mistakes that had caused him immense pain. She wrote that she had lost contact with James Carter. He had moved on to another woman and disappeared, leaving her with nothing. She was now working a menial job, struggling to make ends meet and living with the consequences of her actions. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but she hoped that someday, he would be able to understand why she had done what she had done. She wished him happiness and peace. Mark read the letter with a mixture of emotions. He felt a twinge of sympathy for Sarah, but he also harbored a sense of caution. He had learned the hard way that some people are capable of great deception. He decided to respond to the letter, briefly and politely. He acknowledged her remorse and wished her well. He didn't offer forgiveness, but he didn't harbor any ill will. He had moved on with his life, and he was content with the path he had chosen. Mark's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It's a story of betrayal, injustice, and pain. But it's also a story of forgiveness, redemption, and hope. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, it's possible to find light, to rebuild, and to create a future filled with love, happiness, and peace. He learned that true love is not about possessiveness or control, but about trust, respect, and unconditional support. He learned that forgiveness is not about condoning wrongdoing, but about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and resentment. And he learned that even after the most devastating of betrayals, it is possible to find love and happiness again. He finally understood that his life was not defined by what had happened to him, but by how he chose to respond to it. He chose to respond with courage, with compassion, and with an unwavering belief in the power of hope. And in the end, that's what truly mattered. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. What do you think about today's story? Let me know in the comments below. Share this video with your friends and family who'd love this.